Hi friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast, and we're about to launch off together on a new chapter, Genesis chapter 21, when we're looking at the continuing story of Abraham, and we're reaching one of the key scriptures of the events in the life of Abraham. This is part 162 of our journey together through the book of Genesis, which is season 2. But if you want to, you can go right back to the beginning as we work through the entire Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. Now, I've called today's, or this section that we're going to be doing, looking at this first part of Genesis chapter 1, I'm giving an overall title to it as Keeping a Promise. And that's what I'd like to consider as we approach this text, what it means and what it means in the biblical context. But reflecting on my life and looking back, in 1989, my then wife-to-be and myself, we were going out together as boyfriend and girlfriend, and we'd been doing that for a while. Now, several times, particularly during the recent days, I had told her, particularly, that I loved her, and she had told me that she loved me. I knew I wanted to marry her, and I knew that also I believed that she probably wanted to be married to me. It was sort of becoming understood between us that we would spend the rest of our lives together, would mean getting married, and someday maybe even having a family. Then one night we went out to the cinema, and there was nothing unusual about that. We'd gone to the cinema together many times before, but on that occasion, afterwards, I paused and I looked her full in the face and I asked her, I said to her, "Will you marry me?" We loved each other, we wanted to be together, and even though it was unsaid at the time, I knew I wanted us to be together with her for the rest of my life, and she was the woman I wanted to have a family with. So I offered a promise that day, a promise to love and cherish her no matter what the future held. And she said, for the first time, that she would marry me. The promise was made that night, but it only became real, in a sense, about 10 months later, when we stood together in the church and promised before God and both our families that we would both willingly embrace that engagement promise we had made to each other that day some months previously. Now, I tell you that story because in a sense I believe God did something similar when he made a promise to Abraham, a promise that by nature was similar to the promise that he still makes every believer who comes to him in faith today. But when he does so, and when that promise is offered, what should our response be? And that's what I'd like to think about over the next few podcasts, because this is the experience of no less than what happened to Abraham taken in the overall journey of his life. God, many chapters ago, had made him a promise, but God took a very long time to get around to fulfilling that promise. So I'm interested in looking at God's promise to Abraham and also Abraham's response to it. As a matter of fact, there's even more to this story than those two things, but we'll unpack that as we move forward together. So we're in chapter 21, and chapter 21 in its entirety contains two very different episodes in the life of Abraham. Now, over the next 4 or 5 podcasts, I'm initially going to look at the opening 21 verses, the opening section of 21 where it talks about Abraham and his 2 sons. And we're going to initially this week or so, we're going to begin by looking at the first son and then later on the second son. So let me just read for you the first 7 verses of Genesis chapter 21. Which tells us this. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, and he said, and the Lord did what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. At the very time God had promised him, Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah that she bore to him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." So what I want to draw out of this, and what is particularly to notice today, is the passage is telling us that God has finally fulfilled the promise he made to Abraham. Abraham now is in the midst of living this covenant sacrificial life, one characterized by the contract and the promise that he made with God, and the idea that he is constantly resetting his life by pausing, having the sacrificial pausing, and then moving forward, handing those things over to God, and then pursuing the greater good by pursuing what he believes is the will of God in his life. And this whole thing is illustrated by his decision to embrace the promise that God has made to him, one which not only called him to go out into the world, but which included an heir, despite his and his wife's very advanced old age. Now, of course, he was skeptical about it, and Sarah was very skeptical about it on a human level, and on that level, I suppose they had every reason to be. But this chapter begins here now with a fulfillment of God's promise given to Abraham, initially way back in chapter 13. Now, I suppose one of the purposes of this story and the great long waiting period is to illustrate the dramatic importance and purpose of this child. Now, when people are young, I think it's particularly true in the modern world, they often seem to regard the possibility of having children as an impediment to their lifestyle or maybe even their career. And if I'm frank with you, I have to admit that I thought that way very much from I was about 18 years to I was sort of in my mid to late 20s. Today, we have actually the option to make a decision of when to have a child, which of course people in these ancient times couldn't do. But today sometimes people delay and delay so long that they then spend years chasing the options about having a family. Having a child is the most remarkable thing that you can do in life in terms of a married relationship. And if God blesses you with the ability to do that, you should be thankful for it. And that, in a way, is because you can have a relationship with a child that is different. Some would say better than any other relationship that you can have in your life. But here, in this story, the continual delay of the arrival of Isaac, I believe God is using to highlight the important significance of any child, but of this child particularly. Because it's truly not until you're deprived of something, in a sense, that you can have a real feeling, a real sense of how valuable it might be. And Abraham and Sarah were deprived of this child for a very, very long time. So quite naturally, they're unbelievably excited when it happens, and it also this will then heighten the drama that is inherent in this story because of what is about to be revealed now. Only because it appears that Abraham will now be called upon to sacrifice Isaac, which would be bad enough in any circumstances, but the fact that he's been waiting for nearly a century and that he's lived a faithful and appropriate life, and he has made all the proper sacrifices and lived and tried his best to be faithful to God, that dramatically heightens the tension of this story. So Isaac arrives, and the promise of God comes to pass. But then God seems to be asking something almost unimaginable of Abraham. How in the world are we going to make any sense of the fact that God will now call Abraham to sacrifice his son, his only son, Isaac? This is exactly the sort of story that makes modern people who reach the view that they think we should leave these biblical stories behind us. And society would be the better for it if we did. Because for many, this story is so challenging, it seems almost incomprehensible. Some might say barbaric for God to act in this way. And I have to be honest, I'm nervous in approaching it. I hesitate to approach it because there are so many ways that an interpretation of this passage can go wrong. But I'm going to try my best, and we'll see how it goes. And we'll walk together prayerfully and carefully through it over the next few days. And I'll just read the first 2 verses of it to remind you where we're launching off from. And it tells us this: Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Now there are several things in these verses that, if you're aware of the story of Abraham prior to this point, you'll see that these events being described here are all promises God had already made, promises he had previously made. And it says in verse 1, the Lord visits Sarah, and in verse 2 that she becomes pregnant. Now this is making a point of telling us, pointing out that what God said he would do many years ago, he has now done exactly like he said he would. Another thing that you might notice is it says that he visited Sarah. Now that's an interesting way to describe it, an interesting way to say what went on. What makes it significant is that God uses that term in the narrative on the Bible on a few occasions, and on other occasions are always very dramatic and very poignant, like when God intervenes to save Israel from the Egyptians in Genesis chapter 15. It talks about God visiting. So the word translated as visiting is usually used to indicate the fact and to highlight the fact that there's an event happening here that is of major significance. It doesn't just say God appeared, it says he visited Sarah, which suggests not only some time being spent together, some communication going on, but also it usually means that there's something supernatural happening. That's the point. And in this case, apparently, well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it, that what indeed is happening is miraculous, because she becomes pregnant, and we already know that she is well past childbearing age. So in spite of her age, she is seen to give birth to a son. Now later in the passage, it will also tell us that she nurses the child herself. So that again is another supernatural phenomenon on the Lord's part. A few verses later, it reminds us that Abraham is 100 years old when this happens. And after this, it also tells us he has more children. So he was quite productive in his old age. And this passage is saying, God, on this day, through Sarah, fulfills his promises just exactly like he said he would. God told Abraham he was going to be a father by Sarah way back when he was 75 years old. And they didn't have their first son, Isaac, then. And this is when he arrives. But it doesn't happen until Abraham is 100 years old. So God makes the promise, and Abraham and Sarah wait 25 years to see the fulfillment of that promise. And this passage highlights the fact, again, that God does exactly what he promised to do. And I believe that that is a biblical principle, friends. God may ask us to wait on him in order for him to fulfill his promise. But when he fulfills them, he does exactly what he said he is going to do. We can take other simple illustrations from the Bible. God promised that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem in Micah chapter 5, hundreds of years before the event. And indeed, the Messiah was born in Bethlehem as recorded in Matthew chapter 2. He also said in Isaiah 53 that the Messiah would heal the sick and would suffer on behalf of the people he saved. And of course, we know that from Matthew 8, where that verse is quoted, and from the events of the story of Christ's passion and suffering on Calvary. Because Isaiah 53 reminded us that the Son of Man would die for the sins of man. Now, of course, we know that that's exactly what happened. But did you also know that according to Daniel chapter 9, God even promises not only how this and when this will happen, but when the Messiah would appear. And that time frame was fulfilled exactly as God said it would be. And we'll hopefully get into that in more detail when we get into books like Daniel. But I have a question now to close off today's message with. And the question is, how did Abraham and Sarah respond to the fulfillment of the promise? The promise that God had made all those years ago that came to pass on this day. Well, we'll find that out in the next episode. Today we're covering Genesis chapter 21, verses 3 to 7. Now, you may remember yesterday or the last time that you listened that finally, after a 25-year wait, God had fulfilled his promise to Abraham and to Sarah, and that she had given birth to a son called Isaac. Now, let's just remind ourselves of how Abraham responds to these amazing events. And we'll read together verses 3 to 5, which says this. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now, you may remember Abraham is obeying the Lord in this situation because way back in chapter 17, God had told him to name the son Isaac, which is what he does here. And also in the same chapter, he told him to circumcise his son on the 8th day. Now, what I think we can learn from this is that when the Lord does get around to fulfilling a promise he's made in our life, we should remember what he said we should do, and we should do it in obedience to him. I think the whole story of Abraham is illustrating for us the fact that his faith is growing and maturing all the time. There were times when he faltered, there were times when he fell, and there were even times when he clearly was not trusting the Lord, but he's getting stronger and stronger and more mature in his faith. So now let's pick up Sarah's reaction to these events. Picking it up in verses 6 and 7, it tells us this. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah could nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So these verses are telling us that Sarah had a reaction, and her response was one of joyful laughter. Now, earlier in the story, we saw that Sarah had laughed the first time that she was told about these events, but that time it was a laughter of unbelief. But this time it is seen to be laughter of joy. God has brought me laughter, she says. So she's full of joy because God has fulfilled this amazing promise through her. So this time when God fulfills his promise, Abraham's response we see is obedience, and Sarah's response is one of joyful praise. And I think this is clearly illustrating that this is what we should try and do when God fulfills promises in our life. When God comes through for us, the events that should always remind us that we should be obedient, and the events in this story should encourage us to be obedient, but also to give thanks and to praise him for it. When God does fulfill his promises, the proper response is always, friends, always obedience and praise. But to close out today, I just want to talk for a minute about Abraham's sons and how this passage has identified that there are now two different sons. Now, we looked at the first son, Isaac, a while back, and because you will recall, he already has a son, remember? Remember when Sarah came up with that not-so-bright idea, thinking that God would be able to give her a son, and suggested Abraham spent the night with his handmaid Hagar? And as a result of that liaison, Hagar had a son named Ishmael. Now, there's been quite a bit of tension between Sarah and Hagar, as you can imagine there would be in circumstances like that. First of all, Hagar had the first child, and that elevated her status. She was Sarah's handmaid, and so this was going to be a rather awkward situation, isn't it? And then Hagar lorded over Sarah because of the fact that she got pregnant so easily. So we can easily see that a situation where Ishmael is now likely to do the same thing with regard to this new child, this new baby born Isaac. And this might have the potential to cause substantial trouble in the future. You might say a family split is definitely on the horizon. So what I'd like to do is next time take a short detour and talk about that second son, Ishmael, and his mother Hagar in the next episode. And today we're going to be covering Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 to 13. And we're going to kick off straight away, and I'll just remind you that yesterday, or the last time you were with us, we looked at the birth of Isaac, Abraham's second son. But you remember that he had a previous son, a first son. So what happened to him? Well, we're going to pick up the story of Ishmael because the events now look at him for the next couple of verses, and I'm going to read to you from verses 8 to 10. And it tells us this. The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking, and she said to Abraham, "Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance of my son Isaac." Now I find it rather interesting that on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. Now I did some background reading into this, and I read and found out that the custom at that time was to breastfeed a baby for up to 2.5 years, which seems a long time by today's standard. And then the custom was to throw a feast to celebrate the child being weaned. In other words, the child reaching its first stage of self-reliance. And that forms the background to what's happening here. And it is in this situation that Sarah gets upset with Hagar's attitude. It finally bubbles up and blows over, if you like. And she now feels, with the arrival of Isaac, she feels secure enough to undermine Hagar and her son's Ishmael's status. Now we know by following this story closely that Ishmael was now probably 16 or 17 years old, and he has seen this new baby arrive, and they see him throwing this feast for him, and maybe on a human level, understandably, jealousy sets in. So he scoffs, it says, or ridicules. But I read in the New Testament, in 1 Galatians chapter 4, that Paul quotes this story, and he actually says that Ishmael did more than that. He said he persecuted Isaac. So Ishmael, the son of the Egyptian woman Hagar, he's looking at Isaac with disdain, and it begins by ridiculing and mocking him, and then actually escalates into something even worse. So look at the situation this day. We have Abraham and Sarah delighted because this new child has been born, and he's growing up and thriving and reaching his first level of independence. And you have Ishmael, who's not just angry, but he's jealous, and there's a huge problem now brewing between the mother of Isaac and the mother of Ishmael. Now, can you see that this is not just a matter of just family jealousy, but this is underpinned by the fact that this is a matter of what is going to happen to the inheritance now. Can you imagine, thinking about it from Hagar's position for a moment, a mother sees her son grow up, and then after all these years, she sees this new child come along, and her son's inheritance is threatened. Now, neither side are happy, and neither side want to tolerate this situation. And Isaac's mother, Sarah, she goes to Abraham and says, "Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for this child must not be your heir." So the whole issue is not just petty jealousy. It's much more serious than that. I want my son to have the inheritance that he's entitled to, and I don't want anyone else to get it, and I don't want anyone else to threaten it. That's what's going on here. But remember, friends, it was originally Sarah who came up with the idea that Abraham should go and father a son through this slave woman nearly 20 years earlier. But now, today, she's come to the conclusion that she doesn't want the competition about who will be heir in the future. Now, this upsets Abraham, understandably, and in verse 11 it tells us this. This matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his sons. But God said to him, "Do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. Now, Abraham no doubt loved this son, Ishmael. As a matter of fact, if you recall earlier in the book of Genesis, Abraham even asked the Lord if Ishmael could become his heir. So he loved this firstborn son, Ishmael, through Hagar, and he no doubt, well, very likely he didn't want to throw him out. But so he goes to the Lord in distress and prays or speaks with the Lord, and God says to him, listen to Sarah and do what she says. And he reminds Abraham of the promise he made with him, a promise that he would give him the land, that he was going to bless him, and out of him he would make a great nation that would bless the whole world. The whole world was going to be blessed through the descendants that he had with Sarah, his wife. God then reminds him that the additional child, Ishmael, wasn't even his idea in the first place. It was Sarah's. But it is now, of course, Sarah who wants to send him away. Now, God's response here, I don't think in any way is a plan to punish Hagar and Ishmael. I don't think that's quite what's going on at all. As a matter of fact, there's a good case for saying that it might be for the protection. And remember, he's not saying that she won't and Ishmael won't be the father of a great nation. It just won't be that nation through which the Messiah will come and the whole world will be blessed. But anyway, God, at the very least, promises Abraham that he's going to provide for Hagar and Ishmael. And today we're looking from verses 14 to 21, and we're talking about the situation where Hagar and Ishmael are in the wilderness. So Abraham having sent them out from the home. So I'm going to pick up the text and just read for you a few verses 14 to 16, which tells us this. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on their shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put down the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went down and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And she sat there and she began to sob. What a sorry picture this paints. Now, you may remember that Abraham has been asked to do this, and this is a very difficult situation, but Abraham still, well, it appears in the text that he immediately obeyed. Now, I suggested in yesterday's podcast that the fact that God had fulfilled the promise may have encouraged Abraham to obey this seemingly difficult order, and in doing so, that is a demonstration in the sense that his faith is getting stronger. The result being, even though this was probably very hard for him, he trusted God, and he trusted that God knew what was best for everyone in what was, let's face it, a very complicated and convoluted family situation. Anyway, God told him to send Hagar and Ishmael out from the family encampment, and because God said it, that's what Abraham did. Now, in first reading at a superficial level, you might be forgiven for thinking that God seems to be acting pretty harshly here. But let's just read on to the rest of the story and not just leave it where it's sat at the end of that verse. Because when she leaves and she's out wandering in the wilderness, and it's called the wilderness because it's what we would in effect today call the desert, she's obviously facing a difficult situation. And verse 15 suggests that she got lost and all the water's used up. And she gets to the point where she just places the boy under one of the scrub trees, probably to try and give him some shade. And she goes off to one side and she cries. So Hagar's really in deep despair at this point. But at the points of deep despair is often the same point at which God steps in. And verse 17 tells us, God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. So God hears the cries, and I would suggest the cries of the heart of Hagar as well. And at this point, he steps in, and the angel of the Lord appears to her. Now, this is the angel of the Lord, this phrase again. And whenever you see that, really, I'd want to impress on you that means something very, very important is about to happen. Now, again, I'm not being dogmatic about this, but I think, and many Christians agree, that this is probably the pre-incarnate Christ, the same angel of the Lord who came earlier in order to help keep the covenant that he'd made with Abraham earlier in chapter 12. The promise that he made Abraham, that even though he had done this and fathered this first child through Hagar, the slave girl, the promise then given was that he would take care of Ishmael. God had made a promise, he's going to take care of Ishmael, and that is what he is seen to do here. Verses 18 and 19 tell us, and this is the angel of the Lord speaking, "Lift the boy up and take him by hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water, and she gave the boy a drink. I'm going to care for you. I'm going to protect you. And part of what was involved in getting them sent away from the family environment included God's plan to bless them, to fill his promise separately, and make a great nation from the line of Ishmael. Now, what that great nation came out of Ishmael, well, maybe I say, what were the great nations that came out of Israel? Well, we're seen in this story that Abraham is seen to have two sons. One of them becomes the line of the Jewish nation, and the other becomes the line of the Arab nations. So, and this is the point that we see that God opens her eyes, and she sees a well of water nearby, and she goes and refills the skin of the water, and she gives the young lad a drink, and that way they're both saved. And then it concludes this little section by telling that what's this? God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert, and he became an archer, and while he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. Now remember, Hagar herself was an Egyptian, and she goes and gets him an Egyptian wife. And we find out later in the biblical narrative that he ends up having 12 sons. So what we see in the fullness of this story revealed in Genesis chapter 1 is that Jacob has 12 sons that produce the Jewish nation, and Israel, Abraham's other son, has 12 sons that produce the Arab nation. So God fulfills his promise to protect and to bless Ishmael and make him a great nation, great in terms of size. These verses are simply telling us that Abraham has two sons, and Isaac and Ishmael, and he makes a covenant to cover Isaac, and he makes a different kind of promise to cover Ishmael, and he fulfills both of them here in this passage. Both of them will go on to produce great, huge nations of people, which is exactly what God said he would do from the very beginning. So what I'd like to do, well, next time is sum up by closing up this and summing up this whole chapter, but we'll begin to do that in the next episode. And we've been considering the arrival of Isaac, the child of the promise, and I just today like to summarize and pull together everything we've looked at so far in chapter 21. And in summing up chapter 21, I want to make, I think, what are some important concluding points. I think that when all is said and done, the point of this whole passage is to tell us that when God fulfilled his promise to Abraham, Abraham's proper response was to obey what God had said for him to do, and as a result of that, he and his entire family were blessed. The lesson here hinges on God fulfilling his promises and our response, what we should do when we see that happen in our life. That's the lesson we can learn when we see what happened in Abraham's life. But this main overarching truth, I think, has three aspects to it, and I'd like to just conclude today this chapter 21 summary by summarizing those for you. Firstly, I'd like to say that God fulfills his promises. That is sure and certain. He may delay it, It may not be the time frame that we wanted, but he will always fulfill the promises that he makes. God also made a promise to us that anyone who believes in Jesus Christ is given the gift of eternal life. And that's a promise that we can rely on absolutely, because we know always God is as good as his word. The second promise contained within that is he also promises to answer our prayers. But this promise needs qualifying for a moment. Under certain conditions, if we ask and pray, our prayers are according to his will, and if we're trusting in him, then he will indeed answer our prayers. God, again, is always as good as his promise. But it is on this situation, this is where delays may come in. The delay might be for us that we've prayed for something for years and years and years, and we've not seen it answered, or should I say, not seen it answered yet. But the call on us is to remain obedient, to keep praying, and I think part of the purpose of what this passage is meant to teach us is to do just that, to keep praying and remain faithful in the promises of God. God may delay, he may not do things in the time frame that we would hope, but he always gets round to answering and doing what his will, exactly like he says he would do. But let me give you a third possible learning opportunity that is available to us from within this passage. And this one, friends, is probably the hardest of the three to take on board. Maybe it's easy enough to take it on board theologically, if you like, but it's an awful lot harder to take it on board practically anyway. It is true that God said he keeps his promises and that he answers our prayers, but it also says that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purposes. Now, that's the tough part that underpins all this. Does it really say that? Does it really mean that all things can work for good? All of the situations in our lives, those things that we don't understand, those things that we don't even understand why God has allowed them to happen. Yet the Bible tells us clearly in Romans that all things work together for good. But look very closely at that phraseology. It does not say all things are good. It says all things can work together for good. And that's the point I wish to make today. You may not see the answer to your prayers immediately in your life. In fact, it may take 25 years like it did in this story. The problem is that when we are in points of desperation or we're praying earnestly for things to happen, we're usually in a hurry to see God act if we're truthful about it. We often don't have the patience to just wait on the faithfulness of God. But God, even during those waiting times, is still doing something. Some would say he's especially doing something when he makes us wait because he's helping us develop spiritual endurance. If God gave us everything we asked for immediately, what would happen then? Well, we'd become spoilt Christians. We would remain emotional babies. We would never spiritually mature. And that is a super important part of this message. Yes, God fulfills his promises, but when you and I bump up against something in life, something that's tough, and God doesn't seem to respond at all, or in the way that we hoped, what we tend to do is think, oh my, God's not fulfilling his promises. Things aren't working out how I believe. But it's at that point he will often fulfill another purpose in his life, and that is to teach you endurance. But the actual thing itself may take a very long time, maybe 25 years like in this example, maybe a lifetime, but we still have to trust in him. And then finally, importantly, when he does fulfill his promise, it's vitally important that we remember to give thanks and to rejoice. Genesis chapter 21 should stand as an encouragement for us that when God does come through, to further obedience, great rejoicing, so that when God finally does answer our prayers, that should be our response, no matter how long it's taken. But how about when you've gone through a difficult trial in your family and God finally comes through? That's, of course, a time to rejoice. I shouldn't even have to tell you that that's when we should rejoice. And the Lord, in this story, has done great things for Abraham, great things for Sarah, even great things for Ishmael and Hagar. And I'm telling you, friends, the Lord has done great things for you and for me. And when we see the Lord work, our appropriate response should always be one of joy and praise, but also a further encouragement to obedience, and also to encourage other people by sharing the experience of how God has blessed us by coming through for us, sharing that joy and that experience of God delivering with other people. Suppose today you're sitting here thinking, I've been praying for a long time and I haven't had an answer yet. Or maybe you're going through a really difficult trial at this point in your life, and it doesn't feel that that situation has produced anything good. Well, friends, even now, even today, this passage can remind you that God will fulfill his promises. He's going to do it. And when he does, it's going to be such an encouragement. But in the meantime, you must have faith. Because by doing so, you will develop faith. Be faithful because God will do what he has said he will do. Okay, there we go. That's it for today. We'll be launching off tomorrow and looking at chapter 22 as we crack on with this journey through the Bible. I'd remind you that if you feel you'd like to revisit this and perhaps look at a transcript, the text of what I've said, those transcripts are always available in any audio version of the podcast. The podcasts are hosted on the Buzzsprout podcast website. But if you're watching on video on YouTube or Facebook or some other platform, you will find there's an episode notes page, which there's a link through there into the audio version, whereby in the episode notes of that, you can access a transcript of everything that's been said. There we go. That's it for today. And I hope to see you back here again very soon, maybe tomorrow for you, on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye for now.